Hi, welcome to our continued focus on the skill of speaking. So this is our second week. Just to remind you, last week we were looking at the second language acquisition research findings and what it told us about the kinds of things that we should be leaning towards in our teaching. But second week is where it always gets really practical, and it's going to get practical. I have high hopes that at the end of this lecture, you're going to have a deeper understanding of how to support speaking for your students than I did when I was in your shoes and I was just getting ready to teach for the first time. So that is my hope. There's a few things that you need for this lecture. One that I actually prefer that you print out is the idea. I think I called it something like ideas for creating a language-rich classroom, something like that. And it would be best if you have this printed out. I'm also going to refer to a list of documents that are below that document in our module. The first is Bloom's taxonomy, and Bloom's taxonomy ends up looking like this, with remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating, and it's this whole idea, most of us have been exposed to it at some point, it's this whole idea that there are these different levels of learning. And of course, the big picture is that unless you're really paying attention to this, most of your questions for your students are going to be down here. And if you're teaching in K through 12, what you're in danger of doing is keeping all your questions for your English language learners down here and asking the native speakers the more difficult questions, which is definitely what we don't want to do, right? We want everybody thinking and learning at deep levels. So, your form of Bloom's taxonomy does not look like that, because I found you a really amazing kind of tool, and that is a list of Bloom's taxonomy across the top, but below it are the kinds of verbs that you might end up using when you're asking your students questions. Even more powerful, the kinds of questions you might be asking. So there's actually examples down at the bottom. Pretty cool. We're going to build on that, and this is part of the reason I think that your learning after this lecture might be a lot richer than mine was when I was learning about the skill of speaking. There are 6 documents right below Bloom's taxonomy in your module, and each of them at the top has an element of Bloom's taxonomy. You can ignore, for right now, the DOK. You can just ignore that for now. We're focusing just on Bloom's taxonomy, and so there are 6 of these, and I'll be referring to them at a certain point in the lecture as well. I'll also be referring to our textbook. Okay, so the place that I want to begin is by talking about how this document is a little bit different. So when you first started in the skill of reading, I took the scaffolded reading experiences that are kind of research-based, a list, a menu of options for pre-reading, during reading, post-reading, and I adapted it, I added to it, and so you've got this nice healthy menu. And then I basically did the same with the next 2 skills. But if you take a look at this document for speaking, it doesn't look like pre-speaking, during speaking, post-speaking. And that is because I think the skill of speaking is a little bit different. It's not that we don't need to support our students before. It's not that we don't need to support them while they're speaking or to be thinking about what they should be doing after the speaking. It's not that. But rather, I think that your classroom is always a speaking classroom. It is always a place where students can be carrying out speaking, getting feedback on their speaking, trying out, taking risks, that kind of thing, and moving along in that spectrum of speaking development. So I don't want you to think about speaking activities. I want you to think about your classroom as a speaking classroom. So we're going to push out those boundaries a little bit. So we're not just talking about a specific task that involves speaking, although we have in the unit, and for your post reflection you will as well. But I'm challenging you to think about it a little bit different. Think of it this way. I'd like you to think about your classroom as every moment that you're in there, you're trying to think of how to turn it into a speaking moment, how to exploit every single activity that you do to make it a speaking activity. So that's why this list of activities looks a little bit different, because we are pushing out those boundaries, and we're no longer just talking about before, during, and after. So I'm going to start here at the top, and I think from having been in a lot of teachers' classrooms and having taught myself, I think that one of the key things that you can do to make sure that you're really bringing in as much speaking as possible is to think about your classroom routines. What is it that you want to do at the beginning of class, at the end of class, or that you have to do at the beginning of class or the end of class? And how can you turn that into speaking opportunities? I've got a list there. Take a look. So one thing I've got is get students speaking even before the bell rings. So one thing that you can do is you can, if possible, be in the classroom early and be ready to be talking with whoever walks through the door. I once had a conversation with a teacher who taught at the school, the Nicaraguan school where I do a lot of my work. She taught there before I'd even made my first visit. And she was telling me that she just had the toughest time connecting with the students. And because she didn't speak very much Spanish, they really were reluctant to speak to her in class. But after a while, she turned it around. So I said, how'd you turn that around? And she said she started finishing her breakfast early and going to sit on the bench that was outside of the classroom. She would sit in the sun, and really the only reason she was doing it was just kind of to enjoy the sun before going into the classroom. But what happened was a lot of the students came early too. And so they started sitting down next to her, and now outside of the classroom, without there being a focus on learning, they were willing to answer her questions. And that is how things started to change. She said that more and more people started to show up early, and more people were willing to have those everyday, you and I know they would be BICS conversations. And then when she would start moving towards the classroom, that didn't end for them. That kind of rapport that she had built up with them, that everyday speaking about nothing that directly related to class time, really kind of brought down their affective filter, so they felt more comfortable and they were more willing to engage with her in speaking. So number one, get students speaking even before the bell rings. Whatever situation you're teaching in, think about how to make that happen. Another thing that I suggest is turn attendance taking into a speaking opportunity. So if you have to, or you choose to kind of call roll every day, that's kind of old fashioned, but you could do it when you give students a prompt. Maybe you put it up on the board. You give them a prompt and you ask them to be thinking about that question, and when you call their name, they don't say I'm here or present. What they say is their answer to the question, and that's how you know they're there. So that would be a great way too to recycle something, some vocabulary or a talking point that you were working on the day before. So turn attendance taking even into a speaking opportunity. Consider, here's something I would ask you to consider if it works for you, and everybody's different, and actually every group you have will be different. Consider having a beginning of class routine. Like, what if you had a check-in routine at the beginning of class? Like, everybody put their chairs in a circle, faced each other, and shared whatever they wanted, or there was a question like, how was last night, or did anything exciting happen since we saw you last, something like that. But kind of a general check-in. It doesn't directly relate to class time, but it does directly relate to who the students are. You could also do a fluency builder. What's a fluency builder? Well, let's think for a moment. Let's go back to the difference between accuracy and fluency. So accuracy is to get something right, right? So accuracy with pronunciation, you get the right pronunciation. Accuracy with reading, you read a word and the right definition comes up in your mind and maybe you express that. What's fluency? Fluency is not focusing on accuracy, it's focusing on doing it quickly, easily, almost without thinking. So how can you build up fluency? Well, one thing you can do is what's called a fluency workshop. And a fluency workshop, there's lots of different ways to do it, and you can look them up online for ideas. But the way that I've always done it in my teaching is I have my students form two rows, and so it's people are facing each other. So you've got two rows. If it's an odd class, I become part of the row. So if there's 12 students normally, today there's 11 because one is sick, I become the 12th, so that it's an even row. So what we generally do is we throw out a question, and the first side, whichever side you say is this is side A, they have whatever you want them to have, 2 minutes, say, to tell their partner as much as they can in English to answer that question. So maybe the question is, what did you do last weekend? So they're producing language as quickly as they can, sharing it with their partner. Then at the end of that time, whatever that time period is, you say stop, and even if they're mid-sentence, they stop. And then partner B answers the same question, but with their own answer to partner A. So they have 1 minute, stop. Then what you have is you have line A, the person at the end comes around to the beginning of the line for A, and everybody moves down. So now you have new partners. Now what you do is you tell everyone it's the same prompt, but they'll have half as much time. So if you gave everyone 2 minutes to begin with, now with their new partner, they're required to say the same information. They can't leave any information out, but they've got 1 minute. So after that, then you call time and you repeat. And most of us do it 3 times. So if you start out at 2 minutes, then it goes to 1 minute, and then it goes to 30 seconds. And I have never done fluency workshops with students when I haven't seen a development in fluency. They really work. One thing you have to make sure for fluency builders is that you make sure it's a topic that students really have something to say. It's not an academic topic. It's just everyday language. It's Bix language. So that's one way you can build in fluency. And I have with high beginners or low intermediate students, when I've had a classroom of students who are really reluctant to speak, I've just started every class with a fluency builder. But I don't normally do that. You have to kind of have a sense of what your students need. Another thing that you could do, I've done this before, is to start every class with a free write, and then students share with a partner what they expressed in the free write. I've done this often because sometimes I've had students, a large number of students in my class, who were very confident and comfortable writing, but they were not confident speaking, and they wanted more time to reflect. They were more reflective learners. So if you make this your starter routine, you actually solve 2 problems. You help those students who are more reluctant speakers who want to plan out their response. You give them the time to do it. You also, for them, you solve an attendance lateness, a tardiness problem. Because if everyone knows that as soon as you get access to the classroom, you're going to write the prompt on the board, they'll get there as soon as they can, if they know it's more time to plan before they have to speak with a partner. So the less afraid they are of speaking, the later they will be, probably. But anyways, I'd really like you to be thinking ahead, thinking about what could you build into your classroom routine that students are speaking immediately. Another thing that you could do is to think about, are there any tasks that you could actually assign to students with rotating roles that students would take on, in which they actually would need to report with oral language. So if you're in a third grade classroom, for example, maybe a different student every day is held accountable for coming up with how many people and who wants hot lunch. Another student is taking attendance. Another student is finding out from the office if it's warm enough for outside recess. And then they're reporting to the class or they're reporting to you. Either way, different students each day would have a reason, an authentic reason to actually produce language. And another thing you can do is to build some routines into your class that actually yield more speaking, such as when a student is called on and they don't know an answer, instead of game over, the conversation ends, they don't actually have to produce any language. At the very least, have them need to reach out to another student and formulate a question. For example, Bill, can you help me answer this question? Or Huda, can you explain to me what I'm being asked? That kind of thing. So they can't tell you, I don't know. They have to turn to other people, listen to what they, ask them questions, ask them for help, and then express the answer. So you can build in some routines like that. Your room should be noisy. If I come to visit your classroom in 5 years, whether you're teaching adults in Korea or you're teaching third graders in Wenatchee, I should hear lots and lots of talking. And in a classroom where there's lots and lots of talking, you need to have some shared understanding with the students about when they need to be quiet. They'll actually produce more sound if they know when it's expected that they need to be quiet. So you have to come up with that. Every teacher's different. Some flick the lights, some do a clapping routine, some yell like me. But anyways, you need to kind of think about that and plan ahead. And another thing you can do is you can get students to tell you what the goal of the lesson was at the end of the class period and whether or not it was met. And mirroring that, when you present, okay, today's goal is, and here's the activities we're going to do, and here's our schedule, you can ask students to restate it for the rest of the class. And if a student doesn't know, that's a great informal assessment, right? That probably more than one student actually doesn't understand what the goal of the class is. And so if your students are ready, and if you your goals and your activities and your schedule is clear enough and they know you well enough to know what to expect, you can actually have another student come up and present that. So that's another way you can get students involved. And you can build in a class ending prompt. So you could commit to most days or every day, ending with some kind of prompt and having students turn to a partner and discuss it. You could also do exit tickets, and often exit tickets are a literal piece of paper, but what if your exit ticket was oral? What if today you've been working on new vocabulary and some functional language to get ready for a speaking activity, and on the way out, students need to choose the word or the functional language that was the most difficult for them today and to say it to you on the way out. And it's a way for you to hear where they are. So those are some ways that you could build speaking routines in. And I don't want you to think ever of speaking as a special activity. I want you to think about it as something that's happening all the time. And if you did just half of those in your class would be really rich in oral language. Not your language, the student's language. Another thing you need to do is you need to make sure that your teacher talk is truly inviting, encouraging, and scaffolding for students to actually speak. And the first thing that I have here is I talk about questions. The number one problem that I see pre-service teachers, those who are preparing to teach, who haven't had their own classroom yet, the number one problem I see with the questions they ask is they ask double questions. They'll say, let's see, did you read the chapter? What did you think about that? So they don't wait. They provide two questions. Did you read the chapter? That's a yes/no question. What did you think about that? So even a student who's mastered English, they don't know which one to answer. Which one do you want? So a student who's struggling with English in any way not only doesn't know which to answer, but they're still trying to tell if that was two different questions. So you want to make sure that your questions are in your early months at least of teaching are fairly planned. Think the night before about what are the questions that you want to ask and make sure that they're not double questions. I think that newly practicing teachers ask double questions for two reasons. This is just my theory. I don't know if it's true. I think the first is they're not planning ahead. And so they haven't already figured out what those questions are. And the second thing is I think that they tend to be afraid of wait time. And that's actually number 4 on this sheet for things to think about with your teacher talk is to actually wait. Get comfortable with wait time. Sometimes it takes a long time. The more you want one of your beginning English language learners to speak, the longer you may have to wait so they have the space. I know that for me, with my Spanish, sometimes when someone asks me a question, I'll say, don't move on yet. I just need some time, right? Necesito tiempo. I just need some time. And I just need this little space that I can think, that I can remember that word and I can start to try to express it. So I know how that feels. Make sure that your students have the space and the time that they need to actually answer. So let's go back to number 1. So I'm talking to you about planning your questions, at least in your early months of teaching. And I've now talked to you about singular questions. Open-ended questions are best. That's where you want to live. What did you think of the story? Who do you think was the most interesting character? That sort of thing. So let students take the conversation where it needs to go. Ask those questions. And another thing that I mentioned here is make sure that your questions are delving into Bloom's taxonomy, that you're not just living at that surface level of remembering and understanding. And so this would be a great place for you if you have access to the Bloom's taxonomy, either printed out or on a different screen, to take a look at it. And what you will see is as it moves across the top with starting from remembering to understanding, moving across, you'll notice below that there are verbs, the kinds of verbs that either students might encounter on a worksheet or in their textbooks or on a test, or that you might be saying. But most importantly, at the bottom of that sheet, you see the kinds of questions that you would be asking as well. And so I think that's just a great resource, and you might even want to hold on to that for your early years of teaching. But it reminds, I think it's just another little reminder, and maybe you don't need it, but I think most of us do in our early years of teaching, that we need to be moving towards the higher level thinking, that evaluating, analyzing, creating. Okay. Some other things I want to talk about with teacher talk. One of the things that we're trying to do in classrooms with English language learners is not to talk more than the English language learners, not to talk more than our students. So one thing that often happens is, and I'm guilty of this, is that sometimes an English language learner will say something, and if I'm not quite sure everyone understood, I might restate it. Now, the good news is I'm providing some input, maybe even intake for students, and maybe I've just made input a little more comprehensible by repeating it. But for that student, so I ask a question, the student responds, I restate their answer. Who talked more? I did. So think about instead if a student says something, you're not quite sure everybody was able to hear it, or you're not quite sure everyone was able to understand it. What about asking another student to say it again? What did Huda say, right? And get them to say it. So at least you're not just producing far more language than the students. And probably you've already figured this out from the last lecture. It is okay to recast and to prompt your students, to give them some feedback, whether it's really indirect, like recasting. So if someone says something to you and you turn the pronouns around. So if they say, I go to Chicago this week, you say, oh, you're going to Chicago this week. That would be recasting. It's pretty indirect. But it does provide, as we know, it provides some input and possibly some intake. And then prompting can look, from last week, it can look like in a variety of ways. It can look very indirect. It can look like prompting them with, could you say that again, that kind of thing. But what we know is those things do make a difference. Not as much of a difference as providing lots and lots of time for negotiation and meeting, but they do make a difference. So what I have here is a reminder, feel free to do those things, but I've got kind of an asterisk here, but be sensitive to the student's needs and personality. Remember that the focus is always on producing meaning. And if you have a student who has to work up their courage to speak, and you prompt them in a fairly direct way, it may just crumple them because they really had something they wanted to express to you. So remember, whenever you're prompting, especially, you are taking the focus off of meaning and onto form. And it's not that that's right or wrong to do. It's just you have to be really sensitive to the context. What's the message? How, kind of emotional is this message? The more it's tied to as kind of a student's heart, the less you would want to be doing that, of course. Except for authentically. I mean, if you truly don't understand, you say, oh, I'm so sorry. Can you say that again? That word I couldn't quite understand. That's a different thing. That is truly focused on meaning. So we just have to kind of keep that in mind. I know that I, as a Spanish learner, there have been times that I've had to, especially in my early years, I've had to really work up my courage to say something in a conversation. And someone might turn to me and prompt me by saying back to me in exactly my words, but fixing a grammatical error. And there's sometimes I really appreciate it. But if it's really emotional, if I really worked my courage up to do that, I'm a little deflated. So you just have to be really sensitive to that. So it's not don't ever do it, but it's also don't always do it. You really have to be sensitive about it. Okay, so far what have we talked about? Building a classroom routine that powerfully invites speaking all the time. So if I stop by your class in 10 years, I'm going to hear lots and lots of talking. And making sure that you do whatever you need to with your teacher talk to make sure that it's inviting students to speak, and to speak at those very different levels, not just at the surface levels. So that brings us to, you need to talk less. And that you probably saw that coming already, right? I want to introduce a term that will come up again in the spring course, in the 488 course. It's called balance of rights. And it comes out of research looking at those who are culturally and linguistically diverse in classrooms, in K through 12 classrooms. And essentially what it says is that students have the right to speak in the classroom just as much as the teacher. And there's also a cultural piece to this as well. And we'll really take a look at it in the 488 class. But for here, what I'll say is that you need to be sensitive to your students' cultural patterns and not discount those, and also help them bridge into behaviors that are going to be really kind of expected in academic classrooms in the future. So, for example, if you have a student who, when they talk to you as a teacher, they look down, obviously I know all of you know better than to think that student is being disrespectful. You know that probably this has to do with some cultural background mores about who you look in the eye and who you don't, and when you do and when you don't, that kind of thing. Your students might also be coming from a cultural background in which girls are expected to speak in one way and boys speak in another. So there might be very specific gender roles about how people speak. And that might impact. You might have kids, a large group of students in your class, or a large group of adults in your class, and you notice that the men are, or the boys are interacting in this way, and the girls or the women are interacting in this way. And so you just need to be sensitive to those differences. Does that mean that if you have a Korean female who's hesitant to disagree with an older Korean male in a debate, that you just leave that way? No, that would mean having a conversation. This happened to me in maybe my 4th year of teaching. I ended up having a conversation with the student, and I came to understand how the world looked to her and why she was making the choice not to participate. And I slowly helped her scaffold to a place where she felt more comfortable doing that. And so I would expect no less from you as well. So I started by talking about balance of rights, that means that your students need to be speaking more in class. It's actually their right as a student. And it guarantees, especially the English language learners, that they're going to learn more. And so we really need to chase that. How do we do that? We talk less. So I've got some ideas here for you. I'm hopeful that 5 years from now, if I were to chase you down, you'd have this all written up with lots more ideas that you've developed on your own. And if that happens, share them with me. I always like to learn. So for talking less, use think, pair, share. So you present a question to the class, or you present a little a prompt to the class, or a little mini lecture to the class, and then you have students think for a little while. Maybe they're just thinking, maybe they're thinking and writing, maybe they're thinking and brainstorming on paper, but there's some thinking going on. And then the pair, you have them turn to someone next to them. With adults, we tend to say the person next to you. With K through 12, we tend to say your elbow partner, right? The person next to your elbow. And they share with them. And then it can become share with a small group, like 2 pairs form together, form a small group. And then you share as a whole group, or it can be automatically just share with the whole group. But that's a way to offset you doing so much of the speaking. Another thing you can do is to build in some inductive learning. I think we as teachers often, if we don't think about it too hard, we assume that we really do know all the information, that we really are the only ones in the room who can figure something out. That's deductive, right? That's giving the students the rule, giving them how it works, and then they apply it. What if you turn that on its head? What if you, as often as possible, you put information up on the board, or you put examples for students to think about? And instead of you telling students how it works, you have students turn to a partner or form a small group and see what explanation they can come up with. Everybody shares their explanations, and you know what? Chances are one of those explanations is going to get pretty close to the truth. And so you can build on that. What you just did is you just took a 20-minute mini lecture and turned it into students doing lots of talking, and at the end, they still end up in the same place, except they end up there with a lot more language development. Another thing you can do is you can give popcorn lectures. When you do need to speak, what if students are assigned a role? So a popcorn lecture is you think ahead what it is that you want to express, and it can look so many different ways. I've done it so many different ways. You can, for example, think of, if you have 28 students, you can think of 28 different questions that really need to be answered today. And you can have students, everybody gets a prompt, a question. They turn to a partner to make sure that they both understand their questions. And somebody decides to go first and they ask their question and you answer it. Then everyone else is listening to your answer because they don't know if it's their turn to ask the question or not. It has to be logical. And so you continue on that way. Now, yes, you are doing more talking, but students are getting an opportunity as well. So that can look like a lot of different things. It can also be, it can be questions that before class students are reflecting on and answering, like how would I answer this right now? And so at certain points in the lecture you can say, okay, somebody has question number 4. And what's question number 4? Read it for the class. They read it. What answer did you come up with? And do you have a different answer now that we've gotten this far in the lecture? Lots of different ways you can involve students. You don't just need to be the sage on the stage. Another thing you can do is to build in, and this is kind of a routine too, is you can build in a 3 before me rule, or whatever you want to call it. So if you explain an activity and you check, you have a student say again what it is that we're going to do, and they understand, and there's no more questions, and people get started. If one of the students realizes, oops, no, I don't actually know what I'm supposed to do, they can't ask you. They have to ask 3 other students before they can come up and ask you. What does that do? It gets them interacting. And there's other students producing language, because if you come up to me as another student and you ask me, here's my opportunity to express language. And not only am I expressing language, I'm teaching. And that's kind of the highest form of using language. That's when I think we're called to do the best with our language. So those are some ideas. And of course, the less that you are talking, the more that the students are talking, the more negotiation of meaning is happening, the more noticing is happening. And I hope that I've sold you on how powerful those are. And research really holds how powerful those are. Okay. So the next thing we're moving on is supporting speaking development. And all of this is about the concept of scaffolding. And of course, you know that scaffolding is referring to, let's say that, so for example, I live in this house. It's a 2-story plus house. And if we repaint our house, I can't reach the 2nd story. In fact, I'm only 5'2", so I actually can't even reach the top of the 1st story. And so we have to do something. We have to build something so that I and everyone else working on the house, painting the house, can reach those upper levels. That is a scaffold. And so a scaffold helps someone reach something they couldn't on their own, and a scaffold is temporary. It goes away as soon as the person doesn't need it anymore. So you paint your house, you dismantle the scaffold, you return it to the rental place, and you're done with it. Okay? So what we're going to talk about here with supporting speaking development, all of these are different flavors of how you can scaffold for your students. So the first 2 things that I talk about are making sure that your students have reasons to speak in class. And I can tell you, most of my learning of Spanish has been informal. I've taken Spanish 101 and part of Spanish 102. And I can tell you that as talkative as I am in English, in class, I never spoke in Spanish unless I was absolutely forced to. And so you need to actually require your students to speak, because if they're introverts like me, they're not going to. So you need to make sure that they have a reason to speak. That can look like both of the top two steps here. You can actually have something built in, like today you're using tickets. Everybody gets a red piece of paper. They have to hold it in their hand, and they're you're talking in a small group of 5, and you can't let down that piece of red paper until you've asked a question. Or you can't put down that red piece of paper until you've expressed your opinion. So you can do something like that. You can have a jar with popsicle sticks, and everyone's name is on a popsicle stick, and you just pull them out. And ideally, by the end of class period, you've either refilled it and started again, or at least everyone's had one chance to speak. It may seem like the teacher flexing too much muscle to you, but I can tell you as an introvert language learner that it's actually freeing. If I know I have to speak, then I'm actually not as embarrassed with the classmates around me, because what can I do? I had to speak. If I raise my hand, then I'm saying I actually think that my answer is great, and I'm not quite there yet with my Spanish. So, and right below that, use language use activities. Now, last week I talked about language use activities. I just want to highlight that again. Language practice, language use. Language practice, you have students reading the lines of a dialogue, or students have a worksheet with questions, and you put students into pairs to write down their answers, to come up with what the answers are. One of the students could completely refuse to participate, and everything works out fine. They don't actually need each other. That's language practice. The students don't actually need each other. And the outcome is just more language, to get the answers on the worksheet, find the answers in English, write the answers down in English, say the words in English in the dialogue for the script. It's producing nothing. So that's language practice. What's language use? Language use is when you give your students something they have to accomplish. They have to solve a problem, or they have to find something, or they need to find 3 people in the room who've been to this country so that they can ask them questions. So you give them something to do with language. They're actually using language to accomplish something else. The end result is not language. The end result is something. And everybody has different information, either by design, like, for example, you give everybody a worksheet, but everybody's got different questions, and they all have to work together to prepare for the quiz, because the quiz is going to involve all the questions. So I have a question, I read my question, I come up with an answer, I check my answer, I make sure that I'm right, and then we all move around the room and we teach each other what we need to know for the quiz, because we've all got just a little bit of it. That's language use, where either by design you don't give everybody the same information, or it's just a natural consequence of the universe. So not everybody's been to Ecuador. So finding someone who's been in Ecuador, some people will, some people won't. And so you need to use your language to find that out. And so so that's the most important thing I think you can do to support your students with their speaking development. And then we move into some steps that are really about scaffolding for your students. So for example, number 3, teach and display functional language and sentence frames. What are sentence frames? Okay, remember how we looked at Bloom's taxonomy? Now, what I'm going to refer to are those 6 documents that are below Bloom's taxonomy in our module. And the reason that I have these for you is I think I really think they are powerful, and I wish I would have had something like this when I was beginning to teach. And these are from the Los Angeles School District. So, for example, so with the skill of remembering, right, Bloom's taxonomy level of remembering, Then you've got oh, this is really cool. Look at this. This is for emerging English learners, expanding, and bridging. What does that mean? Well, Washington now uses different terms. Here's the way I suggest that you think about it. Wherever you go, there's always going to be beginners, intermediates, and advanced, right? And so I'd really like you to kind of see it that way. What kinds of questions to find out what your students can remember would you ask beginners? How about the same topic but questions for the intermediates? What about for the more advanced students? And your Bloom's taxonomy has those kinds of things too, but doesn't have it laid out in terms of how those questions might be different for the different language levels, proficiency levels. So I think that is really powerful. But here's where things get really good. Are you ready? Sentence frames. So one of the best ways that you can scaffold for your students is to let them know what's the functional part of the sentence that they can grab onto and use to answer your question. So for example, for remembering, if you are asking students what happened in a story, then you might give students a sentence frame like first blank, second blank, third blank, right? That kind of thing. So first, the man found gold. Second, the man bought a house. And third, the man was happy, right? Something like that. So, and also things like the meaning of this is. The meaning of this is. So if you say to a student, Lake Passé, what does this word mean? Instead of the student having to create this language from the air, they can focus just on the piece that you're really asking them, which is, what is the meaning of this word? Because they've got the sentence frame. Maybe it's right in front of them, or maybe it's environmental print, but they don't have to remember how to say the meaning of this is. They just need to come up with the answer to your question, and then they put it in the sentence frame. So they would say, the meaning of this is, and then they would say it. And the more the student was struggling, the more you would actually even indicate which sentence frame they needed to use. So for those beginners, it would be likely that you would be doing that. So you have 6 of these, and they go through each level of Bloom's taxonomy. I can't tell you how excited I am about that. I really hope that that helps you very much. So sentence frames, no matter what you're teaching, wherever you go, sentence frames are really powerful. Even if you are working, say, with adult refugees who didn't learn to read and write in their first language, so having environmental print with those beginners doesn't help them very much. They can still, they would be oral learners. They would have spent their entire life learning with their ear. And so they could memorize those sentence frames, and you could remind them of what those sentence frames are for them to add that information. So no matter what you're teaching, adults, kids, in the U.S., outside of the U.S., wherever it is, sentence frames are a great way, and I fully expect if I come see you in 10 years that that'll be a way that you support your students with learning and speaking. Some other things I wanted to highlight here. Obviously, you would also be teaching and displaying key vocabulary and collocations. Collocations is a fancy way of saying, we've talked about this before, the words, they're not necessarily synonyms, so they don't necessarily mean the same thing, but they're words that tend to come up in the context. So you, for example, could think, if I were planning a party, what kinds of words might come up? Cups, plates, balloons, celebration, right? That kind of thing. Those are collocations. They don't mean the same thing, but they tend to come up in the same context. So making sure that your students are supported with those. And for almost all students, having environmental print is very powerful. Another thing, another way that you can scaffold for students is to make sure that they're comfortable with pronunciation. And most of you have spent some time in AUAP classrooms, and so you know that AUAP teachers are really powerful and very committed to this. So they, for example, when they introduce a new word, they break it down. They even help students see how many syllables it is and which one's louder. They model it for students, and then they get students to produce it a few times. So students are even just wrapping kind of their mouths and their lips around the word and trying it out. And believe it or not, that makes a big difference. That makes it more likely a student's going to try it out on their own and use that word. You also, of course, moving down the list, you want to provide lots of models of the type of speaking that's your target. You want to give them lots and lots of evidence about how this actually works. And another thing that I have here is go ahead and use lots of groups. Groups are a great way, partners and small groups and larger groups are a great way to scaffold for students. What they can't do alone, they may be able to do with a partner, and they certainly can do with a group. So think of that as a powerhouse of how to help your students, especially any that are struggling, how to help them do better. But if you don't monitor the groups and if you don't have some structures in place, it is very likely that your lowest level of English language learners will not get anything out of it at all. So here I'm saying two things. I'm saying groups are one of the most powerful tools in your toolbox, but if you don't mind them well, they will be your least powerful tool in your toolbox for helping your English language learners speak. So what are some things that you can do? First of all, assign roles or have students choose roles. So, for example, you have a group of 4. One student is the leader, one student is the note taker, one student will be the reporter, and one student makes sure that all of the parts of the prompt are answered, that kind of thing. So, students, you might assign those roles. You might have your reasons of doing that, or you might let students choose those roles. If that's the case, then your English language learner has a reason to speak. They actually have something that they need to do in the meeting. And so, so think about roles. Think about how you can ensure that the English language learners have a reason for sharing information. And also, but make sure that you rotate roles. So you might have a student, I had this happen once, a student who was from an Asian country, and he had been prepared before he arrived in the U.S. His parents had prepared him with reading and writing in English, but not any listening or speaking. And so he developed his listening, but he was very, very hesitant to speak. And so what I might have been tempted to do is to always put him into groups and give him the recorder role. But then he's not pushing forward, right, with what he needs to develop. So be really sensitive to make sure that those roles are rotating. And rotate groups, and be really sensitive to personalities. One thing that teachers often do is they pair up students from the same language. So if you have 2 Korean speakers, 2 Japanese speakers, 2 Arabic speakers, pairing them up. But here's one thing that I've learned over time. Be really sensitive, far more sensitive actually, to personality. If the student who has more Arabic does not have a helping personality, they're actually doing more harm than good to the lower level student who's a native Arabic speaker. So be really sensitive to personalities. Do not assume that putting like languages is going to fix problems, and do not assume for a moment that putting a language learner or a lower level English language learner with a group that has access to more English is going to fix the problem. You need to be moving around and monitoring and making sure that the students have a reason to communicate and that they are communicating. Okay. Another thing you could think about to support speaking development, and I've seen this done in K-12, I've seen this done with adults, is to have students, if it works, have students create either an audio or a video journal rather than a written journal. So, for example, have students every day after school talk for 3 minutes and record it and send it to you. Or they could maybe 3 times a week do something like that. So if all of your students would benefit from speaking practice like that, actually building up fluency, then you assign it to everyone. But you may be differentiating between different kinds of journals that students are keeping. Keep track of what students can do and what they can't yet. So this is where our textbook comes in. And there are some nifty things, and I actually, when you see in the module, it's the only part of the textbook I'm sending you back to this time. I wanted you to take a look because I don't think these are great, but they get you thinking about how speaking works. So, for example, I'm on page 191. It's probably just a blinding glare and you can't see it. But I'm looking at this table down here, or figure, whatever they want to call it, figure. And basically what you see at the top is you see functions. There's informal talk, reporting, discussing, describing, explaining, questioning, debating. And then there's interaction patterns. There's partners, small groups, large groups, linguistic elements. Why does this matter? I think it matters to me because when I see matrices like this, what it reminds me is that students do not have a speaking level of this. Their speaking changes depending on who they're talking to and what the context is and whether or not they're persuading or reporting, whether or not they are explaining or they are listing, for example. And so this kind of thing, although I'm not married to it, it's not great, it gives you an idea of how you can start keeping track of what your students can do in your classroom. So you, for example, before you start a new unit, whether it's 5th grade social studies or it's a new unit with your community college international students who are working on their speaking, you can think about the kinds of talk that they'll be carrying out in that unit, the kind of functional language they'll be using. Are they going to be persuading and debating? Or are they going to be explaining and describing? What are they going to be doing? And don't forget, there's always going to be BICs involved as well. And so you could make that list and you could start to keep track of where your students are, each one of them with those different abilities. And the interaction patterns, really important to know that what a student can do with a partner, they may not be able to do with a group, or what they can do with a partner, they may not be able to do what they can do on their own. So that's just a really kind of a good reminder. There's another one on the next page. What is that? 192. Again, not married to it. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it really gets you to start thinking, just like you already are, about those different competencies that we are asking our students to carry out. So understanding discourse competency, having a sense of whether or not, how something begins and how it ends, and having a sense of social linguistic competency. How formal or informal can I be? What kind of language can I be? What are the topics that are taboo? That kind of thing. So anyways, so I point you to that after this lecture. The final thing that I say about supporting speaking development in your class is inviting play when speaking. Invite play into your classroom. That can look like a lot of different things. It can look like starting out every class period with a joke. Or it can look like you being silly sometimes and inviting students to join you. Maybe you bring in a silly hat and you use a silly voice, or you act something out, and if a student wants to do it, they take over and they put on the hat. So you can also invite play into your classroom if you are teaching, especially if you are teaching students in early childhood, so preschool through third grade, you would definitely want to build in lots and lots of play with language. But I think it's still relevant after that. And I just want to share something really quickly with you. I was speaking at a conference years and years ago, like 15 years ago, and the person before me was presenting about her research in Mexico. She had done qualitative research in an English classroom, and so this was a teacher who taught English to native Spanish speakers, and they were, I think, middle school or secondary students. And the the uh, the researcher who I heard speak, she had a camera. It was the old, tripod with the camera and kind of set up on the front of the classroom. And the students in the class were pretty reluctant to speak. The teacher really couldn't get them to produce much English. And one day the teacher had to leave the classroom. And because the researcher was there was an adult there in the classroom, probably felt comfortable leaving. And the video kept going, and one of the students went to the front of the classroom and became the teacher. And other students raced up and they became the students. Now, all of this was happening in English. And the researcher was kind of bemused, but didn't think about it very much. But what she was examining the audio tapes and the videotapes for was to look at, when did students take steps forward in their speaking development? Like, when did that happen? So every day she's going and she's doing video, and that first time the teacher stepped out wasn't the last time. There were several other times that it happened. And so when she went back into her data to examine where the students' grammatical structures were and when were those moments where they stepped forward, can you guess what she found? I bet you can by now. That when the students played with English, when the teacher stepped out and the students took over and they were running the show and they got to play with English, which means there was no goal, there wasn't a focus on learning, it was just play for play's sake, English for English's sake. They took huge steps forward. And so I was convinced hearing that presentation, and there's been lots of other research since then to support that idea. Invite play into your classroom in whatever way you can. And finally, arrange your classroom for speaking. So actually think about how you have your classroom set up. One of the things that would be important for you to think about is to use a fishbowl. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it because waiting in the module is an example, a beautiful example of fishbowls, and a teacher talking about why he started using them and how they work. So that's waiting for you. Also, there's an early childhood education piece waiting for you on how to think about setting up centers in your classroom. And I truly think that there are days that even for adult classrooms, centers can work. So, for example, you might have a big task that your students are working on, your adult students, your university students, your graduate students, and they come in and the room's been set up with 4 different areas, and everybody needs to visit all 4 before the end of the class period, but when you do, that's up to you. And at one station, they're gathering information. At another station, they're organizing their information. So anyways, you get the idea. So don't write off centers just because you're not teaching 5-year-olds. And consider putting your chairs in a circle rather than rows. Maybe not all the time, but maybe on a regular basis so that students can see each other, and they're more likely, if they can see each other, to actually participate in discussion. Okay, anything else I want to mention? I think that's it. So maybe I'm overly hopeful, but I'm really hoping that at this point you have a really good sense of how you could create a really powerful classroom environment that invites speaking from your students just nonstop. Okay, I hope this lecture really helped, and I'll see you after you make your way through all the materials in the module. I'll see you in our discussion. Thanks.